Darius Carter had never imagined he would one day press his lips against a stranger's. In 38 years as a black man in Boston, through a decade in the fire department, and 4 years as a single dad, he had pictured a lot of emergencies. But not this. Kneeling in the back seat of his Lincoln Town car on a frozen February night, with a woman's lips turning purple beneath his hands, her fingers clawed blindly at her designer purse, searching for something that wasn't there. Her eyes rolled back. Her breaths turned into sharp, ragged wheezes, each one weaker than the last. He had seconds, no EpiPen, no paramedic unit close enough. The 911 dispatcher had said 8 minutes. She did not have 8 minutes. Firefighter training from a past life took over where panic wanted to live. Darius tilted her head back, cleared her airway, and sealed his mouth over hers. It wasn't a kiss, it was a lifeline. He pushed air into her lungs when her own couldn't pull any in. He pressed the heel of his palms into her chest when her heart began to stutter and falter, refusing to let her slip away in the back of a town car on a Boston side street. The woman he fought for that night was Emma Whitmore, 32 years old, and heiress to a $4.2 billion empire. The evening had started like 100 others for Darius. At 7 in the evening, he checked in at the dispatch office, signed out his assigned Lincoln, and scrolled through his schedule for the night. 3 pickups. The first 2 were routine. Business executives heading to the airport, briefcases at their feet, faces lit by phone screens, barely acknowledging that he existed behind the wheel. He preferred it that way. Silence made the hours pass quicker. Silence kept him from thinking too hard about the life that was gone and the smaller one he was trying to protect. His 7-year-old daughter, Nia, asleep across town. His final pickup was at the Four Seasons Hotel, where a charity gala was winding down. At exactly 11:15, he eased the Lincoln up to the entrance, as the revolving doors spilled warm light onto the cold sidewalk. A woman in an emerald evening gown stepped out, shoulders drooping with exhaustion. Emma Whitmore slid into the back seat with the practiced grace of someone raised around chauffeurs and black cars. Up close, she didn't look like the perfect photographs the Boston Society pages loved. Her designer dress was wrinkled, her makeup had faded at the edges. The dark brown hair that usually fell in perfect waves now clung slightly to her temples. She gave him an address in Beacon Hill and turned her face toward the window, eyes distant, expression shuttered. For 20 minutes, the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the faint buzz of late-night Boston. Then she spoke. She asked him to stop. A coffee cart stood at the edge of Beacon Hill, run by a young barista working the late shift, steam coiling up from the espresso machine into the freezing air. Emma wanted something warm, she said, something to wash away 3 hours of forced smiles and polite conversation with people who treated her last name like an ATM code. Darius pulled over and waited. In the rearview mirror, he watched her step up to the cart, accept a paper cup, and wrap her hands around it as if she could absorb the heat straight into her bones. She climbed back into the car and took a long sip. For a moment, her shoulders eased, her features softened. She looked almost peaceful. Then the cup slipped from her grasp. Hot latte splashed across the leather seats. Her fingers flew to her throat. Her eyes went wide with shock and terror. Her breaths turned into sharp, wheezing gasps, each one shorter, more frantic than the last. Darius recognized anaphylaxis instantly. He had seen it twice during his years as a firefighter. Both times an EpiPen had been there within seconds. This time there was no pen, just a woman dying in his back seat while winter pressed cold against the windows. He slammed the car into park, threw open the back door, and grabbed her purse. His hands moved with frantic precision, digging past her wallet, keys, lipstick, receipts, anything that wasn't a slim plastic injector. There was none. Emma had rushed out of the gala too quickly, too eager to escape the endless handshakes and hollow laughter. The one thing that could save her life was still sitting somewhere in a coat check or on a dressing table. Darius called 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional as she promised an ambulance in 8 minutes. 8 minutes. He looked at Emma's swelling throat, her bulging eyes, the purple creeping across her lips. In 8 minutes, she would be gone. The decision wasn't really a decision. It was muscle memory, ethics, and instinct all rolled into one. He laid her flat across the seat, tilted her head back, cleared her airway, and sealed his mouth over hers. It wasn't a kiss, it was CPR. He pushed air into her lungs rhythmically, counting in his head. He locked his fingers and drove his hands into her sternum, compressing her chest, doing the work her heart was failing to do. For 4 minutes that stretched into an eternity, Darius Carter wrestled with death in the back of a Lincoln Town car while sirens wailed somewhere far away in the night. When the paramedics finally arrived, Emma was still breathing. Barely. Her pulse was weak but present. The purple tinge around her mouth had faded to a worrying but improving shade. The EMTs lifted her onto a stretcher and into the ambulance with the efficient urgency of people whose job was to stand between life and loss. Darius stepped back onto the sidewalk, hands shaking, shirt damp with sweat despite the cold. Somewhere deep inside, something had shifted, though he didn't yet have words for it. He started the engine, then turned it off again. He told himself he just wanted to make sure she lived, that it was simple decency, what any decent person would do after keeping someone alive with their own breath. But as he followed the ambulance to Massachusetts General Hospital, another truth pulsed under the surface, the way she had looked at him in those last seconds before the paramedics took over. Gratitude, confusion, and something else he couldn't name. The waiting room was a fluorescent purgatory. Plastic chairs, humming lights, endless murmurs. He sat there for 3 hours. His phone buzzed repeatedly. Mrs. Doyle, the elderly neighbor upstairs who watched Nia whenever Darius worked nights, wanted to know if everything was all right. When he didn't answer fast enough, another message came, this time from Nia herself, who had clearly convinced Mrs. Doyle to let her stay up past midnight. The photo attached was a crayon drawing, 2 stick figures in front of a small house. One tall figure with dark brown skin and close-cropped black hair. One smaller figure with warm brown skin and 2 dark puffs tied with yellow ribbons. Father and daughter rendered in bright marker lines. The tiny family that had remained after a car accident 4 years earlier shattered their old life. Darius stared at the picture until his chest ached. The familiar pull returned between the child who needed him home and the stranger whose lungs he had just filled with his own breath. He should leave, he told himself. He had done what he could. Emma Whitmore had an army of staff, lawyers, and relatives to worry about her. Nia had only him. He was pushing himself up from the chair when the waiting room doors burst open. A cluster of lawyers, assistants, and bodyguards poured in, their expensive suits and hushed voices turning the sterile space into a boardroom. They swept toward the private wing with a kind of urgent entitlement that never needed to ask permission. It was in that moment that the full weight of what he'd done hit him. The Whitmore name was everywhere in Boston. Real estate projects that redrew entire neighborhoods. Hotels hosting presidents and movie stars. Foundations funding hospitals and schools, including the very one they now stood inside. Emma Whitmore wasn't just wealthy. She was a kind of royalty in a city that claimed not to believe in crowns. One woman broke off from the group and approached him, mid-40s, sharp suit, sharper eyes. She introduced herself as Margaret Maggie Lawson, Emma's chief of staff. Her expression was complicated, genuine gratitude tangled with something cooler and more guarded. She thanked him for what he'd done, then asked if he'd be willing to sign a non-disclosure agreement. The document she produced was thick with dense legal language, paragraphs, and subclauses written for people in boardrooms, not drivers trying to keep the lights on. They were worried he might sell the story, she said, that tabloids would pay good money for every detail. They didn't see a man who had simply done the right thing. They saw a potential leak to be sealed. Darius pushed the papers gently back across the table and stood. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but unshakable. He hadn't saved Emma for money or attention or leverage. He'd done it because she was dying and he knew how to help. He didn't want anything from the Whitmore family. He needed nothing from them. He turned towards the exit. A weak voice drifted down the corridor. Maggie froze, then looked back toward the private wing. Emma had woken up. She had heard Darius's refusal through her half-open door and was now asking hoarsely but clearly to see him. The hospital room was more like a luxury suite than a patient ward. Soft lighting, wide windows, a couch in the corner. Flowers already lined every surface. Roses, orchids, lilies, early offerings from people who wanted to be close to power even when it lay in a hospital bed. Darius barely registered any of it, his focus locked onto the woman in the bed. She looked smaller now, swallowed by white linens. Her dark brown hair spilled across the pillow. Her green eyes, shadowed but sharp, studied him with a focus that made him feel as if she were memorizing his face. She thanked him. Not with promises or grand gestures, not with the hollow cadence of someone used to giving speeches, but with simple words spoken like they actually meant something. "Thank you for saving my life." They talked until 3 in the morning. Darius wasn't someone who opened up about himself. Years of grief had taught him to stack his feelings behind quiet routines and late-night shifts. But something about Emma's gaze, the way she listened without glancing at her phone, without interrupting, pulled words out of him he hadn't planned to share. He told her about Sarah, the woman he'd loved and lost, about the phone call 4 years ago that split his life into before and after. One moment he'd been a husband and father, the next he was a widower and single dad, holding a little girl who kept asking when mommy was coming home. He told her why he had left the fire department, that charging into burning buildings was different when a 7-year-old black girl with big eyes and 2 careful puffs slept alone in a bedroom waiting for him. He told her about the long nights behind the wheel, driving strangers through the city while trying to be both mother and father to a child who drew their family as just 2 people, without a third figure in the picture. Emma listened without interruption. Her eyes stayed on his face as if every detail mattered. When he finished, she gave him her own story. Her father had died 2 years earlier, a sudden heart attack, no warning, no chance to say goodbye. He'd been the only person who saw her as more than balance sheets and influence. Business partners wanted deals, socialites wanted connections. Men who courted her wanted access to her fortune. Her father had simply loved her. Since his death, she had eaten every dinner alone. Darius glanced around the opulent room and saw what most people never would. How someone could own penthouses, fly on private jets, sign contracts that reshaped industries, and still feel more alone than a driver in a 1-bedroom apartment. At least he had Nia. When the clock on the wall crept past 4:15, reality seeped back in. Nia would be waking up for school in a few hours. Mrs. Doyle could only do so much. Darius stood and thanked Emma for the conversation. The words felt inadequate for what the night had become. He walked toward the door. Her voice stopped him at the threshold. She asked what she could do to repay him, what he needed, what he wanted. He rested his hand on the door handle and thought of Nia's drawing, the 2 figures in front of their little house. He told Emma he didn't need money or favors. But if she really wanted to give something, she could come visit his daughter someday and tell her about flowers. Nia loved hearing stories from new people. She had an obsession with lilies, especially the kind she'd only ever seen in library books. Emma smiled for the first time that night. The expression softened the sharp edges of stress on her face. She said her mother had loved lilies too. Darius left the hospital as dawn washed the city in gray. Behind him, in the quiet room filled with flowers, Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling, turning over a new and unfamiliar fact in her mind. For the first time in years, she had met someone who wanted nothing from her at all. 3 days passed. Darius slipped back into routine. Night shifts, morning rushes, cereal bowls, and homework sheets. He told himself the encounter with Emma was a strange detour in an otherwise ordinary life. Something he and Nia might talk about years from now as a wild story, nothing more. Then the envelope arrived. It was waiting for him at the dispatch office, thick, cream-colored, with his name written in elegant handwriting. Inside was an invitation. Nia was cordially invited to visit the Boston Botanical Garden that Sunday. Private tour, all expenses covered. The card was signed with 2 letters, E.W., His first instinct was to toss it. This wasn't his world. Private tours and special access were for people who didn't count grocery store totals in their heads. He didn't want Naya stepping into a life she could never actually live in. But Nia found the invitation before he could decide. Her eyes widened. Would there be lilies there? Real ones? Growing out of the ground, not just in pictures on paper. She had only ever seen lilies in books. Darius looked at his daughter's hopeful face, her warm brown skin, her dark curls pulled into two careful puffs, that same stubborn spark he'd loved in her mother, and knew he couldn't say no. Just one visit, he told himself. One afternoon to say thank you. Then they would go back to their small but solid life. Sunday dawned cold but bright. Darius zipped Nia into her warmest coat, the purple one with the missing button he kept meaning to fix. They took the bus because he refused to use his work car for personal errands and couldn't afford a taxi. Nia pressed her nose to the bus window the entire ride, watching the city blur by with the kind of wonder adults forget. Emma waited at the garden entrance. She looked different from the pale, anxious woman in the hospital bed. Her color had returned. Her eyes were clear. She wore jeans and a cream sweater that probably cost more than Darius's rent, but the outfit looked casual. Almost modest. A small pendant glinted at her throat in the winter light. No assistance, no security, just a woman standing alone, hands tucked into her pockets, looking almost nervous. Nia hesitated behind Darius's leg, suddenly shy. Emma did something Darius did not expect. Instead of greeting him first, she knelt down so she was eye level with Nia. She didn't ask the usual adult question, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" She asked what Nia liked to draw. It was a question that mattered in the world of a 7-year-old. Nia lit up. She dug in her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Last night's drawing. 3 colors of crayon were already rubbing off on the edges. It showed their family as it had been until now. 2 stick figures in front of a small house with a red door. A tall figure with dark skin and close-cut hair. A smaller figure with 2 round puffs and a wide smile. No mother, no siblings. Just the 2 of them against the world. Emma studied the drawing longer than anyone usually did. Her eyes shone, but she didn't cry. She understood more than she said. Darius could see it in the way her jaw tightened at the empty space where a 3rd figure might have been. They walked through the gardens together, 3 people passing orchids, ferns, and plants with names Darius couldn't pronounce. Emma pointed out different species to Nia, explaining where each one came from, how they survived, what they needed to grow. She never talked down to her. She treated Nia's questions like they deserved serious answers. At the lily exhibit, Nia pressed her hands and nose against the greenhouse glass. White petals curved open in the humid air, dusted with yellow pollen. The leaves shimmered a rich, deep green. Nia turned to Emma with shining eyes and made a solemn promise. She would draw her the most beautiful lily anyone had ever seen. Emma accepted this with surprising gravity. She didn't offer expensive supplies or private classes. She just said she would treasure that drawing forever. On the walk back toward the entrance, something small but enormous happened. Nia reached out and slipped her hand into Emma's. The gesture was so natural that Darius almost missed it. His daughter, who'd been wary of strangers since Sarah's death, had decided this woman was safe. Emma glanced at Darius, a silent question in her eyes. Could this be more than a one-time visit? He didn't answer. He wasn't sure he trusted himself to. Monday morning shattered the quiet hope of the weekend. A photograph appeared on Boston Society websites and social media feeds. Emma Whitmore at the Botanical Garden, laughing with an unknown black man and a little black girl by her side. The headline leaned into gossip. The comments beneath it were worse. Crude speculation and ugly assumptions about who the mystery driver might be. By noon, Darius sat in his supervisor's office. The company prided itself on discretion. Their wealthy clients expected their drivers to be invisible. Having one of those drivers splashed across society pages, linked romantically to a billionaire heiress, was not something they would tolerate. He was suspended indefinitely. No pay, no benefits, just a few muttered lines about image and policy. He walked out into the cold with his hands shoved in his pockets. Nia's tutoring cost $200 a month. Their rent was due in 2 weeks. His savings might stretch 6 weeks if he was careful and nothing broke. After that, he had no idea. His phone rang while he was still standing on the sidewalk, staring at nothing. Emma's name flashed on the screen. Her voice trembled when he answered. She apologized over and over. She hadn't known anyone was watching. She'd never meant for any of this to happen. She would fix it. She would make it right. She would do whatever it took. Darius listened in silence until she ran out of words. Then he told her the simple, heavy truth that they lived in different worlds. Her mistakes made headlines and gossip. His mistakes made him unemployed and put his daughter's stability at risk. Emma's response was immediate. She offered him a job as her personal driver, working directly for her at double his current salary. Full benefits, flexible hours arranged around Nia's schedule. He would never have to worry about money again. He refused before she could finish. He wasn't a charity case. He hadn't earned that job. And he did not want Nia to grow up believing her father had traded his independence for a wealthy woman's favor. Silence stretched between them. Darius braced himself for anger, wounded pride, the phone going dead. Instead, Emma offered something else. She would talk to his former employer, not to threaten, not to throw around Whitmore influence, but to tell the truth. To explain exactly what had happened in the back seat of that Lincoln, how he had saved her life, how he'd been punished because of her. She would ask them to correct an injustice. Nothing more, nothing less. She wanted nothing from him in return. Darius didn't know what to do with that. People with power, in his experience, used it to take, not to give. He told her he would think about it and hung up. While he sat alone in his apartment in Dorchester, staring at a peeling section of paint on the wall, Emma stepped into a different kind of battle. Her Uncle Richard had been waiting for an opening. Since her father's death, he'd been maneuvering behind the scenes to take over Whitmore Enterprises bit by bit. The photograph from the Botanical Garden was the opportunity he needed. He called an emergency board meeting. In a polished conference room high above the city, he passed out printed copies of the tabloid article and photo. His argument was polished, ruthless, and simple. Emma was unstable, careless enough to nearly die from her own allergy, reckless enough to parade around in public with a working-class driver and his child while the company's reputation was on the line. The business needed steady leadership. He was prepared to step in as interim CEO. Some board members shifted uneasily. A few had known Emma since she was little, had worked beside her father, had heard him say more than once that his daughter would someday lead the company. But others had been hand-picked by Richard over the past 2 years. Their loyalty belonged to the man who had given them their seats. Emma let him finish. Her face stayed composed even as anger smoldered beneath the surface. When it was her turn, she stood and addressed the room in measured, steady tones. Yes, she said, she had nearly died. Not because she was careless, but because one mistake had collided with an unforgiving allergy. A man, a black single dad, driving nights to keep his child fed, had saved her life at enormous personal cost. He'd lost his job because of her. He'd endured public humiliation because of her. Her uncle's first instinct had not been concern for her survival, but calculation about how to use that near tragedy against her. She turned to Richard and asked if he'd called the hospital when he heard. Had he come to see her? Or had he been in this very building counting votes? The room went quiet. Several board members looked away. The vote came down to a single margin, 6-5. Emma kept her role. Richard lost this round, but as he leaned down beside her chair on his way out, he murmured that this was only the beginning. That evening, Darius's phone rang again. This time it was his former employer. His suspension was lifted. He could return to work Monday. Emma had called, not with threats, not with demands, but with a clear account of what had happened and one simple request: make it right. He went back to the dispatch office, but everything felt different. Coworkers whispered in break rooms. They made assumptions about what he'd done to catch a billionaire's attention. No one asked him for the real story. At home, Nia asked about Emma. When would the lady from the garden visit again? Darius didn't have an answer. 2 weeks slipped by. He drove his routes. Emma battled her uncle in boardrooms and back channels. Their lives ran parallel, linked by memory and what-ifs, but not by anything concrete. Then came the rain. One night, Darius finished his shift at 11 and headed home through streets slick with water. Streetlights smeared themselves across the pavement, reflections breaking apart under his tires. When he turned onto his block, he saw a sleek black sedan parked in front of his building. It did not belong on this street. His chest tightened as he recognized it. Emma stepped out, the rain flattening her hair and soaking her clothes. She wore no makeup. Her eyes were red and swollen. Her expensive outfit was rumpled, as if she'd been wearing it for days. She didn't look like Boston royalty. She looked like someone who had reached the end of herself. She told him she hadn't known where else to go. Everyone in her life wanted something, an introduction, a contract, a check. He was the only person who had ever stood in front of her and asked for nothing. Every protective instinct in Darius screamed at him to keep his distance. Emma meant cameras, gossip, trouble at school, and another round of whispers. He'd spent 4 years carefully piecing together a life where Nia felt safe. Emma was chaos. But he also knew what it felt like to be alone at 2 a.m., with nowhere else to turn. He opened the door and told her he had tea. They sat in his small kitchen while the radiator clanked, and the rain traced lines down the window. Darius poured chamomile tea into mismatched mugs, the kind he kept around for nights when Nia couldn't sleep and needed something warm. Emma talked. She told him about Christopher, her ex-fiancé. They'd been engaged for nearly a year before she discovered he'd been feeding information to Richard the entire time. Their relationship had been a move in a corporate chess game she hadn't known she was playing. The man she'd planned to marry had never truly seen her, only her shares. She told him about her father again, this time in deeper detail, how he'd been the only safe place in rooms full of people who measured her value in digits. How after his death she'd realized there was no one left who loved her without calculating what they might gain. Darius topped off her tea and leaned back, arms folded, listening. As a black single dad in his late 30s, he'd spent years keeping his circle small, his head down, building a life where the biggest drama was whether Nia's shoes still fit. Corporate betrayals and billion-dollar fights were foreign to him. Loneliness was not. He told Emma that he wanted nothing from her, and honestly, she had nothing he needed. His life was small, but it was his. Nia was healthy. They had a roof that didn't leak. In his world, that was already more than many people got. Emma let out a surprised laugh. A real one this time, rough around the edges but genuine. She said that might be the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her. A small sound pulled both their gazes to the hallway. Nia stood in the doorway, pajamas rumpled, eyes sleepy and curious. When she saw Emma at the table, her face lit up like it was Christmas. She ran across the tiny kitchen and threw her arms around Emma's neck. She said she'd missed her. She asked if Emma had come back to talk about flowers. The air in the apartment changed. With 3 people in that cramped kitchen, it felt less like a place where 2 people ate and slept and more like a home. Emma stayed until Nia drifted back to bed. Then she slipped out into the rain with a soft goodnight. Something between them had shifted. A wall had cracked, and neither of them knew how to rebuild it. By morning, the world had noticed. Another photograph hit the gossip sites. Emma Whitmore leaving a working-class apartment building at 6 a.m, hair damp, expression tired. The headline screamed scandal. The comments descended even lower than before. Darius's employer called before he finished his first cup of coffee. This time, there was no suspension. He was fired, effective immediately. Not long after, Nia's school called. Several parents had complained. They didn't want their children associating with the daughter of a man embroiled in public scandal. The principal's words were careful and bureaucratic, but the message was clear. Maybe Nia would be better off enrolled somewhere else. Darius hung up and stared at the wall. His life was unraveling thread by thread. Everything he'd built since Sarah's death, every budget, every schedule, every hard decision made for Nia's sake was coming apart. Because he had done the right thing for a stranger and offered her tea. When Emma arrived that afternoon, he didn't buzz her in. He spoke through the intercom, voice flat. He told her that, intentional or not, her presence in his life had wrecked it. He didn't blame her as a person, but he had to protect what was left of his family's future. He needed her to stay away. On the tiny speaker, he heard her start to cry. She promised to fix it, swore she would make it right, begged him for one more chance. He didn't respond. He stood at the window and watched her walk back to her car, shoulders shaking. Part of him wanted to run after her. Part of him was relieved. Emma didn't allow herself to stay broken for long. Her father had taught her that problems required solutions, not despair. The photos had come from somewhere. Someone had been watching. She hired a private investigator. Within 3 days, he traced the source. Cameras hidden and installed by people working for Richard. Her uncle hadn't just been waiting for any misstep, he'd been engineering them. Emma could have taken it straight to the police, could have pressed charges for illegal surveillance. Instead, she chose a different battlefield. She called a press conference. Reporters showed up expecting scandal, denials, counter-accusations, maybe even tears. Cameras pointed, microphones extended. Emma stood at the podium and did something no one expected. She told them about Darius Carter. She described how he had saved her life with nothing but training, courage, and stubborn refusal to quit. How he had turned down every attempt to pay him back. How he had refused gifts and job offers that might compromise his integrity. She called him the most decent and honorable person she had ever met. Then she announced the creation of a new charitable foundation, the Elizabeth Whitmore Family Fund, named after her mother. The fund would support single parents struggling to make ends meet, job training programs, emergency financial assistance, educational resources for their children. It would honor the woman who had raised Emma alone for the first 5 years of her life before circumstances changed and her mother remarried. Emma didn't mention Richard's name once. She didn't talk about the cameras or the corporate war boiling underneath everything. She just told the truth about one man's actions and promised to multiply that kindness in the world. In a small apartment in Dorchester, Darius watched the press conference on TV with Nia curled under his arm, bowl of cereal in her lap. Nia asked if Emma was talking about him. He said yes. She asked if Emma looked sad. He said probably yes. She asked if they would see Emma again. This time he didn't trust his voice enough to answer. As he watched Emma stand alone in front of the cameras, using her power not to protect herself but to defend him, something inside his chest gave way. It wasn't manipulation. It wasn't a PR stunt. It was a woman with too much and a man with barely enough, both trying to do right by each other. He realized he cared about her deeply. The fallout for Richard came fast. Board members he'd handpicked started asking uncomfortable questions about just how far his surveillance had gone. Internal investigations uncovered a pattern of illegal monitoring that extended far beyond Emma. Within days, Richard resigned from Whitmore Enterprises. Everyone in Boston understood what had really happened. He'd pushed too far. His own ambition had taken him down. Emma received a unanimous vote of confidence from the board. She didn't stay to celebrate. As soon as the meeting ended, she got in her car and drove back to Dorchester. She parked in the steady rain and stepped onto the sidewalk, looking up at Darius's window. She didn't ring the buzzer, didn't call his phone. She just waited. Darius watched her from behind the curtain for a long moment. Then he put on his jacket and went downstairs. She told him she wasn't there to ask for forgiveness or favors or another chance. She understood if he never wanted to see her again. She only wanted to know one thing. Was there any possibility that she could be part of Nia's life and maybe, someday, part of his? Standing in the rain, drenched, hair hanging in wet strands around her face, Emma Whitmore looked nothing like Boston's untouchable heiress. She looked like someone who had finally run out of walls. Before he could form an answer, the building door shot open behind him. Nia bolted out in her pajamas, bare feet slapping against the wet concrete, ignoring the rain. She grabbed Emma's hand with both of hers and tugged. She had a new drawing to show her. This one had 3 figures in front of the same little house. A tall, brown-skinned man, a little brown-skinned girl with 2 puffs, and a woman with brown hair. Flowers sprouted up all along the drawn front yard. Emma looked at the picture through a blur of tears. She told Nia it was the most beautiful drawing she had ever seen. Darius stood in the doorway as his daughter pulled Emma back inside. For the first time since Sarah's death, the apartment didn't feel too big for two people. 6 months later, Darius stood at the front of a conference room at Whitmore Enterprises headquarters, demonstrating CPR techniques to a group of new employees. He was no longer driving strangers through the night. After everything that had happened, he had applied for a role coordinating the company's emergency response training program. His decade in the fire department made him the ideal candidate. He'd gone through the formal interview process like everyone else, answered the same questions, sat in the same chairs. He got the job because he was qualified, not because Emma whispered his name in someone's ear. Nia had started at a new school in a safer neighborhood, not a private academy full of pedigrees and trust funds, just a solid public school with teachers who cared. She'd made friends quickly. She still talked about her mother sometimes, still asked questions Darius didn't always know how to answer, but the sharp edge of grief in her voice had softened. She was learning that losing someone didn't mean life stopped expanding. Emma didn't move in. They both agreed that decision could wait. Instead, she came over every Thursday for dinner. She helped Nia with homework, squinting at math worksheets and laughing when she made mistakes. She learned to cook in Darius's tiny kitchen, burning the rice at least twice and setting off the smoke alarm once. She was learning how to be part of something small and messy and real, something no quarterly report could measure. One quiet evening in late October, after Nia had fallen asleep, Darius and Emma sat together on the narrow balcony outside his apartment. The city hummed beneath them, honking horns, distant sirens, the murmur of lives overlapping. Emma asked if he ever regretted that February night. He could have called 911 and waited. He didn't have to climb into the back seat and breathe for her. Darius thought for a while, listening to the low roar of Boston. He told her he had no regrets. He hadn't saved her because of who she was or what she owned. He'd saved her because she was dying and he knew how to help. It was the right thing to do. That was all. She smiled at his answer, a small, soft smile. Then she asked about the kiss, the one that had pulled her back from the edge of death. For the first time that night, he turned fully to face her. He reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand. Her fingers were warm despite the chill. He told her that kiss had been medicine, nothing more. Then he leaned in, closing the distance, and kissed her again, gentle, unhurried, with no sirens screaming in the background and no fear twisting in his chest. Not to save her life this time, but simply because he wanted to. Because she was there, and he was there, and somehow, against every odd, their lives had collided and held. Inside, Nia shifted in her sleep and smiled at some private dream. Above her bed hung her latest drawing, the one she'd worked on for 3 days, erasing lines until it felt exactly right. 3 figures stood together in front of a house with flowers in the yard. A black father, his little girl, and a woman with brown hair. Not just a picture anymore. Some kisses pull someone back from the edge, others mark the beginning of a new life. Darius Carter had given both kinds to the same woman, and in return she had given him something he'd quietly stopped believing in long ago, a second chance at everything,